Good morning and welcome to day 3 of the CTE Zero Emission Bus Conference. I'm Dan Rodabaugh, Executive Director of CTE, and I will be your moderator for our session this morning. I'll cut through the long title that you see on your screen. This is basically a policy session. We're going to be working with key transit and transportation staffers that work in DC on the Hill, putting funding in place for transit and for general transportation issues. So we're super happy to have them here. It's a great opportunity to hear from them, and we really appreciate their time. Before we start that, I'd like to turn the floor over to our sponsor today, which is BAE Systems. BAE has been working with CTE for a little over 20 years. They've integrated several vehicles on CTE projects, from hybrid electric to battery electric to fuel cell electric vehicles, and we've had a great relationship with them. And today I have Amanda Kaufman. Amanda is a fellow mechanical engineer. She got both her graduate and her undergraduate mechanical engineering degrees from Cornell University. She worked in the field at a couple spots, including Boeing, and she's been with BAE Systems for a little over a year. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Amanda Kaufman.
Hi, my name is Amanda Kaufman. Thank you for having me here today. I started my career as a mechanical engineer with a background in fluid dynamics and focused on platform development work, starting with propulsors and propellers and working my way into vehicle shaping. I then got into program and project management that gave me exposure to the autonomy and software side of things, and I became intrigued by the rapid design cycles and new capabilities enabled on existing platforms. This is what brought me to BAE and my current position in FAST Labs, which is our research and development branch, where I've been working on various autonomy implementations that I'll touch on at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Starting with a bit of history, platform design-wise, there has not been tremendous commercial drive towards drastically new configurations or shapes on cars, buses, airplanes, or other vehicle types. There has certainly been some lessons learned in terms of aerodynamics and manufacturing methods that enable mass production of more contoured shapes. However, the majority of the innovation and advances have been in the internal systems, the power plants, the onboard computers and sensors, and the capabilities they enable. Next slide, please. Talking specifically about propulsion systems, BAE has done a tremendous amount of work related to electric, hybrid electric, and fuel cell operation in every domain. Just a few numbers for you. We have over 25 years of electric drive and battery manufacturing experience. We have worked on multiple platforms on over 100 fleets on 3 continents. And to date, we have over 12,000 electrified vehicles and 2 billion in revenue miles. Next slide, please. Digging a little deeper, specifically into the zero-emission bus world, BAE has been working on deploying both battery and hydrogen-fueled zero-emission buses. To date, we have over 300 units, primarily in North America and Europe, with over 10 million miles of service, and are continuing to expand. Next slide, please. Our third-generation system is lightweight and ultra-efficient, enabling operators to travel further on a charge. With technology advances, fewer components and connections make for a less complex, lower cost, and more reliable implementation. We're partnering closely with bus manufacturers to fully integrate and support our systems. I could spend the rest of this presentation digging into more detail of our technologies, focused on how technology maturation in power electronics and battery technologies are enablers for a zero-emission future. But you're going to hear 3 days of these types of presentations, and I wouldn't be telling you anything you don't already know. Instead, I wanted to pivot to a slightly different topic. Next slide, please. And that topic is that I believe that the future of mobility and transit is not just electric, it is also autonomous. For me, coming from an aircraft background, this is really highlighted by looking at the difference in a commercial airliner flight deck between the 1950s and today. Looking at the older flight deck on the left, the majority of the cockpit is taken up by a multitude of steam gauges, and there are buttons and switches and toggles all over the cockpit. Flying an aircraft like this is an extremely manual and hands-on process, requiring ultimate vigilance in watching all of these various gauges to make sure nothing was going wrong. Contrast that to a much more modern flight deck on the right-hand side, where there might still be a few steam gauges as backup, but the majority of the real estate in the cockpit is taken up by a series of onboard computers that allow for the automation of a lot of the tasking, and also for the presentation of important data to the pilots when they need it. This takes a little bit of the onus of flying off of the pilots and onto the automation system. Going forward across domains, I firmly believe that autonomy and automation will relieve at least some of the responsibility of driving or piloting from the operators, and given enough time, remove the need for onboard operators to control their vehicles at all, which will result in long-term cost savings as well as safer operation. That's not to say that there aren't technological hurdles that will need to be overcome, but many of these are being actively worked today. Next slide, please. The Society of Automotive Engineers has defined 6 levels of driving automation. Most current model cars can achieve a partial automation designation between lane assist, active cruise control, and features like that. These are seen as relatively safe driver's aids rather than taking the leap to conditional automation, which would allow the system to actively monitor its environment and make decisions based on that monitoring. It is this higher level decision making that is going to be the biggest hurdle towards the acceptance of full autonomy. Next slide, please. I just wanted to spend a minute talking about the difference between autonomy and automation. I will caveat this by saying that everybody in the industry has their own definition of what autonomy means to them, so it is a very charged term. But for the purposes of our conversation today, automation refers to the ability of a system to control a vehicle directly, such as autopilot or cruise control. Autonomy adds an additional layer on top of full automation, such that the system is now also responsible for making decisions for the vehicle, responding to unexpected hazards and changing conditions without consulting a human. Next slide, please. The keys to enabling fully autonomous operation are certification and community trust. Both are predicated on establishing a clear record of safety and transparency in decision-making of why the system is doing what it is doing. There are 2 approaches to engender this trust. The first is an incremental buildup in capability, using an onboard operator as redundancy in the event that something goes wrong. The second is to strictly control the operating environment of the vehicle and gradually open that up to full representative operational conditions. Next slide, please. So how are we approaching autonomy at BAE Systems and specifically in Fast Labs where I work? Our focus is on pioneering technologies in 3 main autonomy categories. Much of what we do is for U.S. government customers and can be classified. The examples that I'll talk about today are some of our publicly releasable work. Next slide, please. The first category that we are actively working on is situational assessment and understanding. One aspect of situational assessment is maintaining awareness of your environment such that you can respond to changing environmental conditions appropriately. We achieve that through the use of onboard sensing systems and unique data fusion algorithms to combine these sensor outputs into a comprehensive worldview. For transit applications, this correlates to observing other vehicles as well as people, animals, and stationary targets to operate in this complex and ever-changing environment safely. When we talk further about situational assessment and understanding, one example of our work in this area is our multi-int analytics for pattern learning and exploitation, or MAPLE technology. MAPLE uses advanced machine learning technology to analyze real-time or archive data streams, to rule out background activities, and focus attention on infrequent anomalies that may need immediate attention. How could this be relevant to urban transport? It could bring improved understanding of driver schedules, ridership, energy and power usage, system and vehicle maintenance, and more. It could reduce or avoid unnecessary road calls and service interruptions, and deliver improved availability, reliability, and on-time performance, ultimately contributing to better service, revenues, and customer satisfaction. Next slide, please. Moving into machine learning and artificial intelligence, earlier I talked about trusting autonomous technology to make the right decision every time, no matter the conditions. This can be a tough ask for most humans because while machine learning technology has matured, these systems are usually unable to communicate context and confidence in their decisions. Why are they doing what they're doing, and how likely are they to succeed? BAE Systems is addressing this challenge with a software called Mindful, which is meant to improve the transparency of machine learning systems by independently auditing a machine learning-based system and providing the end user with insights to build trust in the technology. Mindful will produce statements like, "The system has navigated obstacles in sunny, dry environments 1,000 times and completed the task with greater than 99% accuracy under similar conditions." Or, "It has completed the task with only 80% accuracy in similar conditions, manual override recommended." Outside of Mindful, BAE Systems has been applying machine learning algorithms, primarily neural networks, in buses for years to help monitor our components, systems, and ancillaries. As applied to the urban transport space, artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies could provide better system-level performance modeling and health estimation, and better predict maintenance intervals and battery end of life. Next slide, please. Finally, mission planning and decision-making encompasses everything from evaluating the operational area to determine what tasks can be completed with the resources available to generating routes to achieve these objectives. BAE is leveraging many of these principles in the urban transport domain on such projects as the Iveco STAR project and Smart Depot. We could envision similar algorithms being adapted to produce buses that can park themselves in the depot without human involvement, as well as automated scheduling of refueling, maintenance, and washing operations to minimize route impacts and downtime. Next slide, please. In conclusion, I hope that I've given you a little food for thought on why I believe that the future of mobility and transit is both electric and autonomous, and some of the really great work that BAE Systems is performing in both of these spaces to bring this future forward. Thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed the remainder of your conference.
Thank you, Amanda. Really appreciate your presentation, and again, we really appreciate BAE's support for the conference. Again, I'm Dan Rodabaugh, Executive Director of CTE, and I'm going to take a little liberty before we get started on the panel to talk a little bit about CTE. I know in the opening day I spent a lot of time talking about climate change, clean air, U.S. jobs, but not as much about our organization. So I was going to take this opportunity to just run through a few slides to make you understand a little bit about how CTE was formed, why we were formed, and how we work. As you can see on your screen, we have 4 service areas, 4 pillars to our organization. The first is prototype development and demonstration. This is how CTE got our start in the early 90s. This was to develop electric and hybrid electric vehicles for military applications. We, under this program in 1995, developed the first hybrid electric Humvee. We also developed Bluebird's first school bus. This was a joint use program. We were looking for both military and private contractors, private company contractors to work on vehicles, on vehicle systems that would work both with military applications like a Humvee or with commercial applications like a Bluebird bus. This group at CTE, it continues to exist in the early 2000s. I think we're probably most known for helping Proterra develop and build and demonstrate their very first bus, which interesting enough was a fuel cell bus. But we've also helped Kenworth with their first Class 8 fuel cell truck. It was on a project that's active right now. We're also working with UPS on several fuel cell delivery vehicles. So the idea behind our prototype development group is to have an independent nonprofit manage the build of the vehicle, do all the reporting, do the third-party data collection, and handle all the funding as the prime. The second area that on our screen is smart deployment, and this is probably what we're best known for in the industry. CTE is working with over 70 transit agencies to provide technical assistance and project management support of their deployments. We've got industry-leading modeling software. We've actually been setting the standard for the past 10 years on how you deploy these buses, and we have the vast majority of the market share in providing technical assistance to transit agencies to deploy these vehicles. The third part of our business is fleet transition. This is relatively new. We've only been doing this for the last couple of years, but we have several transit agencies and municipal fleet operators that have decided to go 100% zero emission. What CTE does is help them develop a strategic plan on how they do that. We take our expertise from building the vehicles under prototype development, our expertise from deploying the vehicles and modeling routes and modeling vehicles and modeling utility rates. Under the Smart Deployment Program, we bring all that together to try to put together a strategic plan to help fleets transition to 100% zero emission. We're working with 22, actually it's 24. We actually won 2 new contracts this week, so it's a timely announcement. But we're working with 24 different transit agencies and municipalities to help them put those plans together. Interesting enough, I know there's a mandate in California that every transit operator has to do it. A little bit more than half of all of the work we're doing is actually outside of the state of California, where there is no mandate, which is an interesting thought. There's a lot of folks that are committing to convert to completely zero-emission vehicle fleet without the presence of a mandate, to do it voluntarily, which I think is very, very promising for the industry. Our fourth pillar is education and outreach. This is how we put the conference on. We do many events to try to bring the industry together, to try to help everybody in the industry network and learn from each other. So this is a map. I think I popped this up really quickly the first day, but this is all of CTE's projects based on our service area. So you can see we've been very, very active all over the country. And I would dare say that nobody in the US or in the world has experienced as CTE is in helping develop, deploy, or build transition plans for transit agencies and municipal fleets that want to convert to zero emissions. So how do we get started? I've just got a couple slides here. It's the first time I've used these slides, so bear with me. But I wanted to try to explain the issue that the DoD was trying to fix when they developed the first program that CTE was actually formed under. It was the DARPA Electric and Hybrid Electric Vehicle Program, and what DoD saw was that from a project management perspective, their program managers were no longer, they had too many projects, they were no longer to actually provide active program management, weekly phone calls, monthly reports, et cetera, et cetera. They were not able to go and verify that work was being done and see vehicles being built. So they started giving the project management piece out to teams. And the problem with that, and this is what I'm trying to illustrate here, if you have a team to build a prototype vehicle, you have an OEM, a vehicle OEM. In most cases on our projects, it's a bus OEM, but it could be any OEM that's building the vehicle. Then you have third-party technology providers. If you're going to build an electric vehicle, you're going to have a battery supplier. You're going to have an integrator. You're going to have an electric motor supplier. You're going to have a utility. You're going to have a charger manufacturer, and you're also going to probably have charging software, charge management software as well. So you have all these technology providers, and who is best fit to actually manage the project? Well, that's the problem that we were trying to solve here. And as you can see from my chart, the bottom line obligation of a vehicle OEM or a third-party provider is to their shareholders, first and foremost, not to the government on a project. It's very, very hard if their vehicle or if their technology is not working as advertised in a demonstration project for them to report that back to the federal government when they've got pressure for their shareholders for this product or this vehicle to be successful. Their executives are always judged, regardless of anything else, on their profit and their ability to make profit. So again, it makes them a bit conflicted as a project manager. And more importantly, they typically don't want to be the project manager. They want to focus on their technology and making their technology work, not on managing federal money, doing reporting, collecting data, and overall project management. It's typically secondary, and I've got these coded as yellow here because it's really their secondary thought, not their primary thought. Their primary thought is making their technology or their vehicle work. So along came an organization like CTE, and there were several consortia that were formed by DARPA at the time. And as you can see here, our bottom line obligation is to the project, period. We are judged by our mission, not by our profit. I say it a lot. CTE does not make money. We're pretty good at not making money. We really focus on our mission, which is to advance these technologies. Our primary market objective is not a particular interest. It's the entire industry. So we feel like we represent everybody involved in the industry. And of course, from a project management, we focus on the entire project. And most importantly, from a budget and financial management perspective, federal acquisition regulations can be quite daunting. If you're trying to sell a product with your accounting software and you're trying to manage a project at the same time, it can be quite a shift because the federal government requires your accounting system to look a certain way to manage these funds, regardless of what else you're doing with it. At CTE, that's all our accounting system does, is manage federal and state money to deploy these projects. So we're set up to do it. We understand the reporting requirements. And then as an independent, non-biased project manager, we feel like both the team gets a better product out of it and the federal government gets a more of an honest broker in reporting back on how these projects are going. So it also occurred to me, the reason I'm doing it in our policy section is that's also why I think CTE is a great and effective advocate on behalf of the industry, both in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento. And I've got everything yellow here for the vehicle OEMs and the third-party providers because, again, the nice thing is people on the Hill certainly understand where you're coming from, but it's really, really hard for an individual entity to say they represent the entire industry when their first obligation is to their shareholders and to trying to make money for their company. So it's very, very hard to make a choice what's best for the industry if it's not actually best for their particular interest. So they are effective in DC. They do go up there, but it's very, very hard for them to represent anything more than their particular product and their particular shareholders, not the industry as a whole. And I think that's what's great about CT, and that's what's made us effective, is we're up there and we're very, very clear. Our focus is our mission. Our mission is to move these technologies into the marketplace. So we want to advance the zero emission bus, zero emission vehicle industry. So that's what we focus on when we're up there. And I think we've become a very credible source in DC to represent what we think is best for everybody, not a particular interest. So that kind of summarizes what we do, how we work, and why it's important that CTE be active on the Hill, because we feel like we are a very trusted resource. And we are active on the Hill. As you can see, we've got 2 representatives, one in Sacramento that we've been working with about 7 years. We've also got Suzanne Sullivan, who I've been working with for 18 years. I go 10 to 12 times a year, with the exception of the COVID 2020. I've been 10 to 12 times a year every year to DC to tell the story on what we think is best to move the zero emission vehicle industry forward. And it's through some of those relationships that we're able to bring you this panel session today. So sit back, be sure to ask questions, and let's move forward with the panel. I'd like to introduce our panelists. If we could go ahead and get you guys to turn your cameras on so we can see your pretty faces. There we go. First, we have Jen Deasy. She's a senior professional staff, U.S. Senate Banking Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. We have Homer Carlisle, who's professional staff, U.S. Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. I'm going to close this window so I can see y'all's face. We also have Sarah Piro, who's professional staff, U.S. House Committee on Appropriations, Subcommittee on Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. You guys have some really long, impressive titles. I had to read them, and I've known you guys for a while. So before we get started, let's see. We got everybody here. I see Homer, I see Jen, I see Sarah. Okay, great. My first question for you guys is, in a world where we're seeing an awful lot of chatter, a lot of political chatter, right versus left, right versus wrong, we see it everywhere we go. Whenever I'm up there, I'm struck by the fact that you guys work so well together, even though you may represent folks on different sides of the aisle. So can you talk a little bit about how the business is actually being done in DC and how you guys interact with each other?
Hey Dan, I just wanted to start really quickly. I know Homer and I at least get sent with disclaimers from our comms department. So just wanted to share that our comments are off the record and not for attribution. They're our own and don't necessarily represent my boss, the chairman, Homer's boss, the ranking member, or the banking committee. But with that being said, very clearly, Homer and I work very closely together. We work quite collaboratively, particularly on the issues of zero emission buses. I think there are a lot of efficiencies that can be driven, modernization that is far more bipartisan than some of the other areas that we work on at the committee. So I think, it's safe to say that Homer and I are in fairly constant contact, and similarly with our appropriators, I think we all get a lot more done when we can work collaboratively and kind of leverage each other's processes to move the ball down the field on this issue.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Jen. When people joke on the Hill that there are Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators, and that in the Appropriations Committee, we certainly all of the staff that work on transit get along extremely well. We've worked together in lots of different places in our careers, and we like each other, and that helps to facilitate trust. So certainly when we get to a place where things are sticky, which of course happens, although less on the transportation side than on the, let's say, health or certain other places, we have that base level of trust that we can rely on and work through issues to get to a solution, hopefully.
And Sarah, I'll just follow by saying I'd echo everything you said and everything that Jen said about kind of the spirit of collaboration that we have between the transportation staff. And a lot of that flows from the fact that, despite the fact our political system really is at kind of a terrible state of gridlock on many issues, and we are at the height of that, kind of as we approach a campaign, transportation has remained one of those issues where there is really good bipartisan work done, both at the staff level and at the member level. There's a lot of member interest in trying to keep working on transportation bills on a bipartisan basis. It's just been one of those things where when other major legislative initiatives are faltering because of partisan differences, we still had success over the past decade in passing big transportation bills. Doesn't solve every issue. I mean, some of the big challenges like how do we pay for a transportation bill, are always sticky. But at least as we're working toward solutions on things like how to deploy zero emission buses, we do have a lot of good collaboration on a bipartisan basis.
Great. So I'm sitting here and I've got some authorizers and some appropriators, or an appropriator. A lot of people have a hard time understanding the difference. I know you're both working on an authorization bill and appropriations bill. Could you take a stab at explaining the difference to everybody and then talk about specifics on the bill you're currently working on?
I can start with that. My background is actually in the budget wonk world, so I think I have a slight perspective. And I actually, so in Congress, there's always the how it's supposed to work and how it actually works. So I'll start with the how it's supposed to work because that helps. Know that transportation is an anomaly when it comes to how things are supposed to work. But I also imagine there are people who are listening and watching who are interested in the energy side of things as well. I think a way to think about an authorization bill is that it's authorizing the appropriation of funding. That means it's saying, appropriators, when you get to writing your bill, your annual bill, you should spend up to this amount of money. Authorizing bills tend to also be multi-year bills, whereas appropriations bills tend to be for 1 year only. The appropriations bills are effectively the writing of the check. The authorization bills, on the other hand, tend to have most of the policy about how programs should work. And now, of course, appropriations bills often have what are sometimes called derisively riders, which do have some policy. But the authorizing bill really sets out the framework for how a program should work, whereas the appropriators come along and then provide the money to make that program work with tweaks. In transportation, the authorizers do actually provide the real money to run a program. The appropriators, however, come along and limit that funding for programs that are funded from the Highway Trust Fund. For programs that are funded from the general fund, not from the Highway Trust Fund, is a typical appropriations process. An example of that is some of the extra funding that the appropriators have been providing for zero emission buses over the last several years. So for example, in addition to the $55 million that was provided annually in the FAST Act, last year we came along and provided $75 million for a total of 130 with some additional general fund amounts. That's sort of a general gist of my explanation of authorization versus appropriation. I'll let Jen and Homer pop in if they've got anything else, or I can talk a little bit more about where the fiscal year 21 appropriations bill is.
I think that was a lovely explanation. That was very eloquently said. I would have gone with something along the lines of Homer and I kind of write the rules and you guys help us pay for it. But I think you laid it out fairly nicely. Homer and I typically work on the longer term bills. You guys all know the FAST Act, which is our current 5-year authorization bill that expires in a couple of days, but we spent a lot of time developing the 5339C program, the No and Low Emission program, and through the last 5 years of working with you all, working with CTE, we are hopeful that when we sit down to finish a comprehensive long-term reauthorization bill, that we can incorporate a lot of the things that we've heard from you guys and learned from interacting with you all. I know we discussed last year, I discussed at CTE, the Zero Emission Bus Conference, fleet transition plans, and that's certainly something that Homer and I agree in a bipartisan way is something that needs to be incorporated into agencies' consideration as they move towards applying for zero and low emission buses. So I think currently, as you may be able to tell from my comments, we are at a stage in which we are hoping to do an extension that is clean to the current surface transportation bill. As you all are very well aware, COVID-19 shook up everybody's plans. And at this point in time, everyone seems to be coalescing around the concept that the best, from a federal perspective, we can do is provide you guys with some certainty in terms of what the rules of the road are, as you guys are trying to ensure that everyone is safely able to get back on your systems, and we can kind of figure out what it all looks like when we turn the lights back on. So Homer, anything else?
Yeah, no, I mean, as Jen mentioned, for the authorizing side, all of our bosses are working toward trying to get toward a 1-year extension of the FAST Act so we can provide that certainty. Maybe I'll just also add kind of a comment about kind of our role at Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs. So we are the authorizers are the ones who kind of set the structure for programs. And so then we kind of update structure as the conditions on the ground change. So our committee first authorized low-no specifically back in MAC 21 as part of the research program. And that was when the buses were a little bit more, at the testing and demonstration phase. And then in FAST Act in 2015, we, for the first time, made it more of a full deployment program and provided money from the trust fund for it. So expanded the program, provided direct funding from the mass transit account of the Highway Trust Fund. And then, as Sarah mentioned, in the most recent appropriations bills, the Appropriations Committee has been able to add some additional money on top of that through their annual bill. So that's kind of how these things evolve.
I would just add one other thing, which Dan, I mentioned last year, which is that just because there's that $55 million set aside doesn't mean that you guys are limited to that pot of money. So you guys are more than welcome to use your formula money as well as your regular bus discretionary money. Homer and I have talked a lot with FTA to ensure that the rating process should not limit you guys from making the 5339B, the discretionary pot of money, available for you guys to compete in as well. So,
and I'll give just a quick update on where the fiscal year 21 appropriations process is. To start with the lead, which is we fully expect there to be some sort of continuing resolution by the end of September to keep the government running for an indeterminate amount of time. Probably past the election, certainly. The House has passed all of our fiscal year 21 bills, or vast majority of them, and we are waiting for the Senate to move forward. I don't expect there to be a lot of activity on that front for a few, until after the election, because then people will have a lot more information about what's going to happen in January, one expects. And we definitely have additional funding for low and no buses again this year. In the House bill, there was $125 million.
Great. Well, I know Jen mentioned COVID-19, and we've been spending 2 days here together, and we've talked a lot about how zero emission buses in the long term really help with public health in congested urban areas. And if you have better, healthier lungs, you're less resistant to these viruses. There's all sorts of good things. It makes people more willing to ride public transit, zero emission. They would rather be on it. It's quieter, it's cleaner. There's all these good benefits, but in the near term, it can't be at the top of everybody's mind when transit agencies really have very little revenue. So could you guys talk a little bit about what's happening COVID-wise short term, and how you're keeping your eye on the prize, long term for transit as a transportation avenue in the U.S.?
Well, maybe I'll start by saying that, short term, or especially my boss, so Sherrod Brown from Ohio, very cognizant of the conditions on the ground at transit agencies and how they've been affected by COVID, how they are still serving a lot of their core routes and a lot of essential workers, but a lot of their choice riders, like everyone else, is working from home these days. And so ridership has really taken a dramatic hit and cut lower on a lot of routes. So it's an enormous fiscal challenge for agencies, just an enormous logistical challenge to make sure they have proper PPE and doing everything they can do to prevent transmission of the virus on buses. And we were fortunate in that the CARES Act, we were able to secure $25 billion. Thank you to the Appropriations Committee for their hard work on the CARES Act to support public transportation in response to the COVID-19 crisis. You know, from my boss's perspective, the CARES was an amazing, you know, investment in, you know, continuing these essential services across the nation. But for many agencies, particularly the largest transit agencies, the CARES funds are starting to run out. They have put those monies into grants. They've spent it on their operations. But unfortunately, there's not a lot left in the pot for the CARES funds, particularly at the largest transit agencies. And so their fiscal situation next year, or even later this fall, or you know, this winter, is going to be very tight, and it really could result in some tragic cuts to service, some layoffs, furloughs, really difficult times. And so that is going to be a point of discussion when Congress gets to the next COVID relief legislation. I'm not going to speculate when that's going to happen. If you read the papers, you can see pretty clearly Democrats would like a COVID bill right now, and there's, you know, debates about, you know, when and how much. So we don't need to get into that, I think. But the point is that that is one angle to address this is further COVID legislation. But moving ahead, you know, certainly we do need a long-term reauthorization to provide stability for the programs. That's really the next step, is once we get through this immediate COVID crisis, that we have a long-term reauthorization, long-term transportation bill, so agencies can start to plan their future.
I would take a slightly different approach at that question, and just saying that, you know, I think some things that Homer and I have been thinking about in terms of obviously CTE and your membership's desire to advance the interest of no and low emission technologies. I think we've really been focusing on how do you do better deployments. And so, like I mentioned before, some of the things that our bosses are interested in talking about as we do move towards a comprehensive bill, hopefully in the next year, are making sure that there are fleet transition plans. So it's okay if you buy 1 or 2 buses, as long as you kind of have a plan for what you are doing with those 1 or 2 buses. I think our technical capacity requirement in the current statute, FTA took to mean you've done a grant before, which Homer and I did not intend for that to be what that meant. So I think you'll see some clarification on what sort of technical capacity we expect from transit agencies as they apply. Creating economies of scale is something that we know is important. So kind of figuring out how we do better procurements, so that to the extent that agencies are choosing to use no and low emission vehicles, that we are doing it better, smarter, more efficiently on the procurement side of the house, as well, are things that we're kind of focusing on that advance, you know, the speed with which zero emission and low emission buses are deployed.
I would just pop in and say, I think we're still in from the appropriations perspective, once there is the next COVID relief bill, we are still in the stemming the bleeding sort of approach, the right now approach. As Homer said, many of the largest transit agencies received 4 to 6 months of operating assistance out of CARES, whereas some smaller and mid-sized agencies received a year's worth of operating assistance, or what the equivalent of. So trying to figure out what the fairest and best way is to assist transit agencies so that they can get essential workers to the places that they need to go. I do think that long-term, there's going to need to be some sort of economic stimulus, because we're in a situation where that's likely going to be needed. And if that's the case, that's a place where, on top of a long-term reauthorization bill, there could be some additional funding for low and no emission buses, with the understanding that this is a long-term improvement in health. But, you know, I think right now we're really still in the middle of the crisis, immediate response sort of perspective, and it's very hard to see past that.
I'd add that it kind of makes things a little bit more difficult for us as we're looking at what the next steps are, as well as, you know, in the COVID response, as well as with reauthorization. as we're trying to kind of figure out how folks are using their CARES Act money. So we've obviously given a wide range of flexibility. You can use that money on however you would like, on capital or on operating. As Homer and Sarah noted, a lot of the larger systems are nearly or have depleted their resources on operating, whereas some systems, some small and mid-sized systems, are still kind of considering where they are and whether or not they need to use that for operating or capital. And so that's kind of something that we're still waiting to assess as we're waiting on agencies to actually use those funds. So I think, and in one sense, it has been helpful to us to kind of figure out where folks are placing their resources as we look towards the next steps there.
Great. I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I know you guys are familiar with this, TVIDC. Now for the audience, because we've got, I think, a lot of new folks in the audience, new to the zero emission bus world, but TVIDC is not my acronym. It's FT acronym, which is Transit Vehicle Innovation Deployment Centers. See, I can hardly get it out of my mouth. But under that program, we're doing a couple things. One, CT put a panel together that included executives from medium, small, large transit agencies across the U.S. to get a good representation. All bus OEMs have executive leadership on that panel. We have APTA on that panel, CalStart's on that panel. We also have the bus testing center at Penn State, and also the component testing centers that were awarded through FTA at Auburn and Ohio State. And the purpose of this panel is to try to organize what hurdles does the zero emission bus industry need to overcome. What do we have from a testing perspective, from a research perspective? How do we incorporate Ohio State and Auburn into that? So just really a two-part question. One, how familiar are you with the recommendations that came out of that panel? I know they were given to FTA. And then just two, from a bigger picture, panels like this and hearing from the industry as a whole, do you find this useful, and is this something that you'd like to see the industry do more of?
So we certainly saw the TVIDC recommendations and included some of them with some money in our report in the fiscal 21 bill. For me, who is genuinely interested in the zero emission bus and zero emission vehicle industry, it's really helpful to have a consensus report. I think of it as analogous to like a transportation research board type report where you have a consensus or potentially a compromise, but that's helpful to, when it's still a relatively niche industry, to have that analysis and not have to go do it myself.
Yeah, I'd say we appreciated greatly FTA and CTE pulling everybody together and getting them all in the same room. As you were kind of alluding to, Homer and I tend to meet with certain OEMs or certain transit agencies or certain, some of the, Auburn, Ohio State or Penn State at Altoona individually. And obviously everyone has kind of their own agendas, but it's been very helpful for us to have you guys facilitating this conversation and letting us know those pieces that we're missing, having everybody sitting at the same table to say, okay, I'm okay with you doing this and we'll do that. And I think that's the sort of input that we have a hard time parsing out with just the limited interactions that we have with the industry. So I think we found it to be greatly helpful. We are looking forward to incorporating some of the recommendations in the statute when we get the chance to do a comprehensive bill, and are certainly supportive of some of the efforts that the appropriators have made to include some of the recommendations in their bills.
Great. Well, we've got a bunch of audience questions. I've got a closing question that I want to ask, and then we're going to turn it over to some of the questions that are coming from the audience. My closing question is about workforce development. I think we actually have some questions along those lines as well. We've talked about these buses and the zero emission technologies and what they offer the environment, what they offer as far as quiet ride and clean rides, but they also offer high-tech, high-paying jobs to the workforce. So it's really, and it's high-paying and high-tech jobs to a workforce that should include everybody, should include from a technician to a driver to somebody that operates or plans and schedules. So from a workforce development, we have a long way to go because the technology is new. what have you guys got in place, or what do you think, do you see in place that's coming from your work that will help train the workforce to operate and maintain these vehicles?
Well, workforce training is something where the Federal Transit Administration has played a fairly modest role to date. And it's something that we recognize that, there's enormous workforce challenges out there within transit agencies. Older workforce, like many industries, they're expecting a lot of their qualified mechanics and others to retire in the coming years. And so they really need to attract new workers and make sure they have the skills necessary for new technologies. So it's something which we're always interested in getting feedback from the industry on about, what role can FTA play and what role other groups can play, and how best to support that work. Great.
All right, questions from our audience. The first one I can answer quickly is a nonprofit. How does CT stay afloat in terms of finance? Barely. We don't have profit in what we do. So, there's no, I mentioned stakeholders or stockholders. There's nobody that we're paying. Most of our work is cost reimbursable. We get about 90% of our funding from managing projects, winning projects on behalf of our members. We do have a membership, and membership helps pay for some of the expenses that we have that aren't focused on program management. But yeah, cash flow is always a problem for a nonprofit, and we try to work through that as best we can. We have lots of work and very little money. I mentioned it earlier. We're very good at not making money, but we do do a lot of work and do a lot of project management, and that's really what keeps our doors open. Okay, let's see. This is a good one. I know it's going to make Jen smile. Are there opportunities at the federal level to exercise pent-up private capital looking for economic development projects with a transit focus? What is the history of P3 activity and the current appetite for such structures?
It was the #1 priority of my former boss, chairman at the time when we were at the FAST Act, Senator Shelby from Alabama, who's now the full committee chairman of appropriations in the Senate. So still very involved in his interest has not waned in trying to figure out how we unlock some of that private capital and that private interest. We worked very closely throughout writing the FAST Act to figure out what that appropriate balance was of ensuring that it was something that could be bipartisan and included in the FAST Act. I think we've met with a number of stakeholders throughout the last several years to try and figure out what tweaks folks are interested in the industry, whether it's from the public side, the private side, the federal the federal transit agency side. So I think one of the things that we're looking at doing is clarifying what the rules are, when the rules apply. It's a program that we've been desperately trying to get accomplished for the last several reauthorization bills, but are hopeful that this next bite at the apple that we'll get will be the one that magically unleashes all that private interest. But to the extent that folks are out there that are interested, I know we've seen a few P3s as it relates to some zero and low emission deployments. We'd love to see more of that. They don't have to be just giant capital projects, building tunnels and rail. They can be bus projects. So we encourage anybody that's interested on either side of that conversation to shoot us a note or give us a call. We'd love to talk about what you guys perceive some of the barriers to be, and whether or not they're there. We're more than happy to address them.
Yeah, great. I actually have some good news since last we talked. We have, the problem with the P3s from my perspective has always been the private part of that, private equity, trying to find folks that to want to invest. But we've seen a lot of, I think over the last 3 or 4 months, a lot of interest. And we've had a couple companies come forward that are looking to possibly outlay the money to purchase vehicles and then just receive a monthly payment to operate those vehicles from the transit agency, which is much more of a model that takes place in Europe. So we're starting to see, I think, that take off a little bit. And so we'll be talking more about how we can make that work. I think what it needs is a pilot to show that it does work in the US. And so we're working through that now. All right, the LONO program only funded 1 fuel cell bus project in the last few years. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Is there anything, Anything about the legislation itself that precludes fuel cell buses? Is there anything that you've considered to maybe set a floor so that at least a certain percentage of the money goes to fuel cell buses? Have you thought about that any?
Well, I'll say generally that the low-no has always been intended to be technology neutral, right? We in Congress, particularly congressional staff, are not the experts in what is going to be the best technology for the industry moving forward. So we're really looking for the stakeholders and the agencies and groups like CTE to bring forward the best applications. Certainly, I would, from my boss's perspective, would encourage FTA to strongly support fuel cell projects. One of the questioners on the chat is Kurt Conrad with SARTA in Canton, Ohio, who has, I believe, the largest fuel cell fleet outside of California and has just done a tremendous job demonstrating the possibility of that technology. And so from my boss's perspective, he really wants to see additional investment in fuel cell as well as electric battery deployment. And as you say, let's find the right roles for both technologies.
I just echo what Homer said. I think we've been really conscious to not step out of our own lane and choose a technology. I'd encourage folks that have an interest in using fuel cell technology to work with you guys, to talk to FTA, but there should be absolutely no reason why fuel cell is favored any less in the ratings process than any other source of no or low emission technology.
Yeah, I mean, while I watched the debate yesterday between fuel cell and battery electric, that's about the extent of my knowledge on the difference, and definitely agree with Homer that congressional staff are terrible at making these sorts of distinctions. I would just note that in the fiscal year 21 bill, we did put a minimum award on our the low-no bus awards, with the thought that it could either, I mean, this is after talking with Dan and other folks who came in, it could either buy multiple electric buses, but it certainly, or maybe that would help fuel cells a little bit to compete, because while it's a little more expensive, we don't want FTA sending out grants for a quarter of a bus.
That's a wildly bipartisan thing.
Yes.
Right? Nobody, right. You're not going to put windows on your bus, and so that was an attempt that may help. I don't know.
Yeah, and even if an agency is able to scrape together the additional funds to buy one bus, that's not going to give them a lot of lessons in what it means to really integrate that one single bus into their fleet.
Yeah, I think, and that's, going back to that fleet transition plan. Like, if you are buying one bus with the intention, I think Chicago bought one bus, but it's a big system. They had a plan to try that one bus and then to truly deploy it and launch that. So again, if an agency wants to buy just one bus, great, but they shouldn't be limited to getting the resources for a half of a bus as a result of the FTA's choosing to implement the program in that way. So I think that's something very bipartisan that we're looking to address, is kind of minimum grant awards sizes going into a comprehensive reauthorization.
And just as somebody that's kind of worked with the agencies and worked with the folks that we're talking with here, I think fuel cells have been a victim of the idea that we want to spread this money to as many transit agencies as possible. So you end up with very, very small awards. And as we said, fuel cell right now, especially with a station that goes with it, is more expensive. So we've been making a concerted effort to say, I've made recommendations as much as I could to say, well, maybe we should set aside 20% of the money for fuel cell. But if we raise the floor, if we continue to raise the floor so that even if you're buying battery electric buses, you're not buying one or two, you may be buying 3 or 4, so you can actually depend on them in service for a block or two. And I think if we can get where there's not a push to have so many awards, then fuel cell is going to do fine. I don't think there's actually a bias against fuel cell at FTA. I think it's really just been the victim of this idea that we want to spread this out, as much as possible, which is why we're pushing for higher and higher floors, because there's just a lot of benefit to that. So let's see, we're 2 minutes. I'm going to ask one more question, and I think it's a good one. It just came in. In order to advance the fuel cell or fuel cell electric vehicle infrastructure is a key. And I think this is true for batteries as well. Can the government invest more in infrastructure? You know, I think there's a general idea that too much goes to the buses and not enough to the infrastructure. Do you guys have any comment on that?
Yeah, it's the low and no emission buses and bus facilities grant. So that's something that we have been very clear with as folks have come to us and said, man, we wish we could use this on charging infrastructure or on redoing our bus shed or what have you. That is all perfectly eligible. You can apply to FTA for a grant to help you with the infrastructure. Now it's just infrastructure for the federal transportation portion of your project. So we're not putting, you know, charging stations all up and down I-95, but to the extent that you're interested in charging infrastructure or modification of your existing facilities, that is more than eligible within the existing law.
Okay, great.
Also,
oh, go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say, I mean, I don't know enough about it, but there are certainly Department of Energy programs that can provide that funding as well, but they don't fall under the flood bill.
Okay. Well, I do want to thank the panelists, Jen, Sarah, Homer. We really appreciate your time. We're going to try to wrap up on time. I know people have other meetings. Also want to thank our sponsors, particularly BA Systems for this one, but our sponsors for the program overall. And I want to bring everybody's attention to our last session, which is this afternoon, Innovations at Scale. Again, it's going to be more samples of folks that have deployed zero emission buses and have good experience with zero emission buses. So I hope everybody tunes in. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.